Hi everyone, and welcome to part 2 of this 3-part docuseries all about how badminton became an Olympic sport. If you're watching this video and haven't seen the first one, then it would make sense to go watch that first. Click the link in the top right, or if I've forgotten to do that, click the link in the description. And if somehow I've forgotten that as well, then it'll be on my page somewhere. Anyway, instead of just diving right back into the story, let me quickly recap part 1 for you. The IBF first applied to become an Olympic sport in 1964. They had quick success and were given a spot at a demonstration event at the 1972 Munich Games. The event went incredibly well, being well received by those who watched it and by the IOC themselves. However, the IOC were reluctant to discuss badminton's Olympic inclusion further, deferring it on 4 separate occasions over the next several years. Another reason why this was happening was due to a growing political issue, namely China not accepting Taiwan as its own country. The IBF were happy for the Chinese Badminton Association to join the IBF, but because of China's political standpoint, they refused to join. But China, through many friendly matches and tours, had developed some allies within the IBF who started pushing to get China in, even if it meant Taiwan had to leave. Because of China's clear strength in the sport, many federations felt the only way for badminton to develop was through China's inclusion, and a sacrifice of Taiwan was necessary. This caused numerous contentious and spirited AGMs, with each year passing becoming more contentious than the previous. This came to a head when in 1974 the Asian Badminton Confederation did what the IBF wouldn't, welcomed China and kicked out Taiwan. At the 1975 IBF AGM, even though the same result was found, because it didn't meet the 75% majority required, it failed. This result, plus another big issue surrounding voting rights, the ABC members were not happy, with their Secretary General Tae Gin-soo saying that the ABC urges all Asian nations to boycott any tournaments organised by the Badminton Association of England. This was right at the end of 1975, and it's right at the beginning of 1976 where we pick up this story. "1976 was only days old when a huge story hit the badminton world. The Asian Badminton Confederation further bolstered its boycott on BOV tournaments by announcing its first Asian Invitation Championships. The date for those championships? Exactly the same as the All England. This was further bolstered by the Nippon Badminton Association, who on January 11th passed a resolution to boycott the 1976 All England. This news was worrying for the IBF, as they were acutely aware of how something like this could affect their Olympic bid. But on February 5th, it seemed any initial worries of theirs might have been unnecessary. Lord Killinan, IOC's new president, made a statement on TV that the Olympics was certainly getting too big, that it needed to downsize. But with that, he also said badminton was knocking on the door, and that the IOC should focus on sports that don't cost a lot of money, implying that badminton was one of them. This positivity was somewhat short-lived, as although the All England that year was on the outside a success, still drawing in a good amount of Asian players, it wasn't without its issues. You shouldn't be surprised to hear that this issue once again involves China and Taiwan. No, of course, China didn't send any players, they couldn't, plus they were playing in the Asian Invitation Tournament, but the Taiwanese Association had sent their own players, only for them to refuse entrance to the country, their visas denied. The reason for this was that the Chinese government had lodged protests about Taiwanese visiting Britain. And just like what was happening a lot back then, the British government gave in to the demands, choosing the easy way out. What makes this whole situation even more farcical is that surrounding the All England were tournaments in Denmark, France and Switzerland. The Taiwanese players faced no issues at those tournaments. This whole situation didn't end there either, the opposite in fact, as it was taken to the House of Commons in Westminster. Crazy! This, however, was just the beginning of a country's legal system dealing with the issues of the badminton world. Once again, to get there we start with an AGM. Of course we do. On the agenda for the 1976 AGM was numerous issues and proposals, with the main one being the China issue. Again. The calling to remove South Africa, citing the UN, This was due to the apartheid happening. Czechoslovakia put in the proposal for the removal of the 75% majority when deciding on the removal of a federation, asking that a simple majority is enough, with a simple majority being more than 50%. And another voting proposal was put in by Czechoslovakia, Thailand and Pakistan, and that was that the number of votes per federation should reflect how many members are under that particular federation. Whilst on the subject of voting rights, it was in the May 1976 edition of the World Badminton magazine that they printed a rather scathing letter from Mr. Balasubramaniam, who was actually the vice president of the IBF at the time. In this letter, he does get a few facts and figures wrong, vastly overestimating how many badminton players of the world fall under the ABC. He states 75%, but it was actually around 28%. But pedantic figures aside, he made the very good points that the ABC's main area of contention with the IBF and the true reason behind the boycotts was the voting situation, not the China issue as the IBF had kept reporting. He claimed the IBF were archaic and undemocratic, and that the BAOV, the oldest of the federations, was to blame. This explains why only BAOV tournaments were targeted for the boycott. He ended his letter by saying the only way there will be unity again is when a national organisation shall have one vote. Sadly for the Badminton World, this wasn't going to happen anytime soon, and things were going to get a hell of a lot worse before they were going to get better. June 2nd, 1976, at the Erawan Hotel in Bangkok, Thailand, the 37th IBF AGM took place. For the first time in IBF history, the AGM was held outside of London. But whilst it may have been a change of scenery, what went on inside the AGM was pretty much a repeat of years past. Except for one moment, a moment which took everyone in attendance by surprise. The usual China-Taiwan issue was being discussed, with plenty of arguments for and against. The vote which followed was 45 for and 35 against, meaning that once again the proposal failed. End of debate. Right? Of course not. Discussions continued with the mention of an old cable from China's 1974 application still being effective. This clearly couldn't be accepted, but the president of the IBF, Stuart Wyatt, for some reason let the discussions continue. This is where it started to get interesting. During these discussions, Taiwan's full backstory and history with the IBF was made known. This was mainly delivered by Mr. G. Kandappa of Sri Lanka, formerly Ceylon. Remember them? One of China's first ever allies? In what was an incredibly spirited monologue, Mr. Kandappa called Taiwan imposters and demanded that the Federation recognise them as a province of China, thus calling into question their membership to the IBF. This clearly made an impression on Stuart Wyatt, who said he would give a ruling on this whole situation after lunch. Everyone that was present was expecting another copy and paste speech with all the main talking points that have been heard countless times over the past several years. Countries can have two federations in the IBF, China are welcome to the IBF want China, etc, etc. But instead they got this. Now I'm not going to sit here and read all of this, but I'll give you the summary. Because the Taiwan Badminton Association had changed its name, something of such importance, that they should have had to reapply for IBF membership. As a result, Stuart Wyatt ruled that at the next AGM, or an EGM, that Taiwan must reapply for membership alongside China's application. And even though it was ruled that Taiwan was still a member until this was sorted, in essence Stuart Wyatt had just excluded Taiwan from the IBF. Like I said, everyone was shocked by this ruling. Both sides couldn't quite believe what they had heard. None more so than the Taiwanese Badminton Association. And they weren't going to just lie down and take this. And just like they had done following the All England where their players were denied visas, they once again sought legal representation. The Taiwanese Badminton Association hired a law firm from London who wrote letters to the IBF to get the ruling rescinded, saying it was done so illegally. When this failed, they issued writs against Mr. Wyatt, Mr. Molin, and the Honorary Secretary to seek annulment of the ruling. But neither of these were successful. It seemed that the IBF were dodging the issue, and with the 1977 AGM just around the corner, it didn't seem like any conclusion would be met before it went down, which meant that Taiwan were facing the very real prospect of losing their membership at the IBF.
Den går ud, og Lene er verdensmester. Er der nogen, der har fortjent det, så er det i hvert fald hendes. Efter sejr på 12.
The 1977 World Championships, badminton's first World Championships. It was supposed to be a joyous occasion for badminton, and whilst the action on court certainly was, off court it couldn't have been more opposite, with Friday of the championships being dubbed Black Friday. It was on Friday 6th of May, during those World Championships, that the IBF held its AGM, and as you already know, the biggest item on the agenda was once again the China-Taiwan situation, although it was very different this time. Even though the IBF president had received the summons to appear before the High Court in England concerning the legality of the 1976 ruling, Mr. Molin still went ahead, putting to a vote whether the federation should continue with proceedings. 49 to 30 in favour of voting on Taiwan's membership was the result. However, because Taiwan had been fighting this through the legal system, and having been told it was illegal, they hadn't actually reapplied. Subsequently, this meant that Taiwan was no longer a member of the IBF. The ruling is what led the day to be dubbed Black Friday. The whole AGM was incredibly politically driven, and it wasn't just China leading this. It was the majority of Asian nations too, although their views were much more skewed towards badminton and its future. They not only sympathised with China's stance that Taiwan was a part of China, but because China was so good at badminton, and that they had such great infrastructure for badminton, they felt that they were the right choice if badminton wished to grow. Also, it must be noted that before Stellan Molin became president of the IBF, he was the representative for Sweden, a country who during the previous two AGMs had led the proposal for China to be included. This may have seemed like a victory for China and its supporters, but it was to be short-lived, as the Taiwanese Badminton Association were able to finally get the IBF in front of the High Court of Justice in England, winning their case emphatically on all fronts. This ruling was discussed at a special council meeting of the IBF, where they decided that this must be discussed and voted on at an EGM. An EGM which was quickly set for September 29th, 1977 in London. And if you thought the AGMs so far were feisty, then this AGM made those seem like a birthday party. Almost immediately after starting, Mr. R. Avery, an Englishman now residing in Iran representing the Iranian delegate, flew into a tirade, claiming that on behalf of the ABC that the Taiwanese delegates shouldn't be there. He continued on for another 40 minutes, criticising the actions of the council and certain officers of the federation. He even went off on the Thomas Cup, accusing the previous honorary secretary Herbert Scheel of manipulating the draws. Mr. Avery didn't stop there, going on to say that the council didn't have the power to overrule the 77 AGM ruling. He asked all ABC delegates to not vote, and then called the whole EGM illegal. Oh, and then he said something minor, like if the vote went ahead that the ABC would create its own World Federation. Even with this threat, the vote went ahead, and although the majority was still in favour of expelling Taiwan, it wasn't the 75% needed. Taiwan was back in the IBF, but this now left the very real possibility that the badminton world could split, and if it did, how would this leave badminton and its Olympic hopes? That 1977 AGM, as was the case with the previous four, was a contentious one, filled with mainly negatives. That's not to say though that there weren't positives, and in 1977 there was one big one. It was reported that for the 1984 Olympics in LA, the IOC were looking to add 2 new sports, and badminton had a very realistic chance of being one of them. With everything that had been going on and brewing, badminton's Olympic chances were still there. And this chance became even stronger when on 15th of November 1977, IBF President Stellan Molin received a letter from the Technical Director of the IOC, Mr. H.R. Banks, saying this: "I am writing to inform you that the International Olympic Committee, at its 79th session in Prague, considered the proposals of the Programme Commission and the IOC Executive Board concerning recognition of non-Olympic sports in their international governing bodies. I have to advise you that your application was favourably received by the session and that recognition could be granted, subject to compliance by your federation with eligibility rules in non-conformity with TOC Rule 26 to be incorporated in your constitution. This requirement now having been complied with by the addition of Appendix 2 in the regulations governing amateurism in your statutes book, and the fact having been reported to the IOC Programme Commission and the IOC Executive Board at their last meeting, I am pleased to inform you that the sport of badminton, under the control of the International Badminton Federation, is duly recognised by the International Olympic Committee. Just 9 days after this letter was received, on November 24th, there was a meeting held in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, with a familiar name presiding over it, Tae Gin Soo. In this meeting there was only one agenda item discussed, the formation of a new world federation. At this meeting were representatives of 11 Asian countries, one gentleman claiming to represent 11 African countries, and another representing a European country. Interestingly enough, Japan, a long-time ally of China whose side this federation backed, didn't attend this meeting, nor did Indonesia. This new federation was established all within one meeting, being called the World Badminton Federation, WBF. And that speed didn't stop with just their formation, as they quickly arranged 2 more meetings to establish their rules, regulations and statutes, as well as tournaments, with one being a World Championships. All of this, from the letters being sent to world associations inviting them to the initial meeting in Kuala Lumpur, to the meeting to finalise details on the World Championships, called the World Badminton Invitation Championships, took just 4 months. And with it in a way, they killed badminton's Olympic hopes. It took just 4 months to bring down 14 years of work. But from reading this through, I do understand. I understand the frustrations felt by the members who joined the WBF. The bureaucracy, the voting rights, the China situation, the lack of progress from the IBF, the seeming lack of respect for Asian countries, the overbearing control of some European countries, it all culminated in them feeling they could do it better. This whole situation was summed up quite well in the January 1978 edition of the World Badminton magazine by Craig Reedy, a person who you might hear a fair bit about in the remainder of this story. In his article, he not only explained things in a logical manner, but he also tried to air some of IBF's opinions, as more often than not they opt to remain somewhat impartial. Mr. Reedy said that the political landscape of sport at the time was difficult for most sporting federations to navigate, but that the IBF's apathetic stance towards the whole thing hasn't helped. He finished by saying the court ruling, one the IBF could do nothing about, was the final straw that broke the camel's back. This formation of the WBF naturally was one of the main talking points heading into the IBF's AGM that year, which was to be held on May 18th in Auckland, New Zealand. As you can likely imagine, this AGM was yet again another contentious one. The Asian Badminton Confederation and the Hong Kong Badminton Association both resigned from the IBF. Taiwan was once again voted on for their removal from the IBF, a proposal which once again failed, this time not even reaching a majority, 27 to 30 in favour of Taiwan staying. Whilst it seems favour for Taiwan grew, mainly due to their opponents already forming their own World Federation, they did receive a lot of backlash over their actions, namely going to the High Court of Justice to settle the dispute from the 1977 AGM. Some members present even tried to pass a rule where IBF-affiliated federations were not allowed to bring legal action against the IBF. This didn't pass. One thing that did pass was that the Taiwanese Badminton Association must drop the ROC from their name. The ROC was seen as inflammatory and unacceptable. Begrudgingly and under protest, the Taiwanese BA accepted this and dropped the ROC. As 1978 progressed, so too did the newly formed WBF. From November 4th to 7th, they successfully ran their first World Championships, and things seemed to be moving in the right direction. It was because of this, combined with the fact that the IBF knew they needed unity to get Olympic approval, that they reached out to the WBF to see if they could get a round-the-table discussion and work things out. And there seemed no better place than at the 1978 Asian Games, which were being held in Bangkok, Thailand. If this meeting took place, and if so, what was discussed, I don't know, as I couldn't find any reports on this issue. But based on the fact that the IBF invited the WBF to have round-table talks during the Thomas Cup Badminton Finals in June 1979, shows to me that the Asian Games meeting either didn't go well or didn't happen at all. And I'd be inclined to say it didn't happen, because on April 7th, 1979, it was reported that the WBF flat out said no to the IBF to those talks. In that article, the Joint Secretary General of ABC, Finsak Suthikul, explained why. "We have said no to the invitation. For 10 years we have tried to change one rule in the IBF constitution, but have not succeeded. Therefore we see no reason why we should have talks with people who are not prepared to listen to us. All that the members of the WBF wanted was that each country in the IBF should have one vote. We did not want disparities. Thailand had 3 and some countries only 1 or 2. Similarly, there were other nations which had 3 votes, although other stronger badminton playing nations had fewer votes. Why should there be differences in voting rights if all of us are members of the same body? This is the crux of the dispute, and it will remain unsolved as long as IBF is adamant. There is no politics, no China issue, as has often been mistakenly stated by the IBF. Some IBF members are still under the impression that the rift took place because China had not been admitted as a member of the IBF. This is wrong. Our demand has been and will continue to be for just a voting system, fair to every country. So all the talking, all the discussions the IBF wants to have will be reduced 10-0 if they do not agree to our proposal. Feinsack did go on, saying that the WBF were actively looking at developing a World Cup, were planning their second World Championships, and were doing all they can to expand the game into Africa. They didn't want to waste time in fruitless conversations with the IBF. It seemed, at this point anyway, that any sort of reconciliation between the IBF and the WBF was not possible. Although right in the corner of that article I just cited, there was a glimmer of hope. A judicious move on part of several members of international badminton associations might yet get the IBF and WBF together. At a meeting in Montevideo, Uruguay, which included Lord Killinan of IOC and Air Chief Marshal Dawi Chulagapia, an IOC member as well as president of WBF, it was agreed to request Thailand to withdraw its lawsuit against IBF. There is now much hope amongst world badminton officials that this destructive rift in our international associations will soon be healed. I couldn't find anything on such a lawsuit, but that's beside the point. There was hope for this meeting to happen, and what was even more positive for the IBF anyway was that Lord Killinan, the head of the IOC, was involving himself. But whilst this certainly helped, it took help from somewhere else to bring the two opposing sides of the badminton world together and begin some difficult talks.
Saudara-saudara, untuk melengkapi acara penutupan ini,
May 28, 1979, the Thomas Cup finals in Jakarta. With the help from the Indonesian Association, the IBF and WBF met for the first time to discuss the future of badminton. Although the meeting occurred in Bandung, not Jakarta, away from the badminton action. Unification talks weren't on the table quite yet, but this discussion was mainly about two things: to air the grievances from both sides, and to also try and come up with some solutions so that both federations can, in a way, work together, not letting their differences ruin the sport of badminton. There were 5 main things that IBF President Stellan Molin hoped to find agreement with the WBF on. 1. The IBF could sanction play between the members of both bodies in multi-sport events, e.g. Commonwealth Games. The IBF could grant sanction for some limited contact with WBF members in bilateral friendly matches between 2 countries only. The WBF could stop sending invitations to players from IBF members to tournaments run by the WBF. 4. Stop politically based action and statements against IBF and its members. And 5. Join with IBF in a study group to examine, among other items, the voting structure of a unified federation. These discussions didn't come with any world-shaking progress, but it did seem that both governing bodies were able to talk amicably. They were even able to enjoy a game of golf or 2 together. This wasn't going to be a quick process, but both sides were open to discussions, and the suggestion of the study group was agreed upon, although arranging for a time when they could meet proved difficult. With clashing work schedules, visa issues, etc., it took some time, but eventually they agreed on a meeting in mid-December in Hong Kong. In the build-up to that meeting, it certainly seemed like things wouldn't change. Both sides did give some leeway, but at the same time neither were willing to give too much. They both agreed upon allowing friendlies between federations from both sides, with one famous one being Indonesia versus China in Hong Kong. But whilst this was a step in the right direction, what halted it slightly was that when India asked to join this friendly, in essence making it a mini-tournament, this wasn't allowed. It was also quite clear from these early stages that whilst the IBF wanted a united badminton world, the WBF were happy to keep it as 2. During the study group meeting, it was proving to be a logistical nightmare to accommodate 2 separate world governing bodies. It seemed as the new decade was approaching that there would be a deadlock between the 2 federations. But then news came from China that could change it all. China, realising the importance of Olympic involvement, wishing to join it, started to ease its hard line on Taiwan. There had already been moments of Chinese and Taiwanese athletes sharing a court or field in other sports, and even Chen Si of the Chinese Badminton Association readily conceded that the same could be possible in badminton as well. This statement by Chen Si brought with it the end of the 1970s. Plenty had happened, some positive for sure, but it was marred by fighting, political strife, politics, and even a split in the badminton world. But it seemed as a new decade was beginning, a new hope came with it. The IBF had already begun its so-called open era, but to allow that to be really true, first they had to unite the badminton world. The 1980s, the beginning of the modern era in badminton. This was not because the badminton world was all together, but that the IBF, having launched open tournaments the year before, were embarking on their first full year of it. And I believe it was this new direction from the IBF, coupled with China's easing of their hardline on Taiwan, that opened the door to the badminton world reuniting. I say that because whilst the IBF were being innovative, putting on more and more tournaments, offering opportunities for their players, the WBF had become stagnant. In fact, by the time the 1980 AGM occurred in May, a number of federations that left the IBF for the WBF were coming back, with one of those being Thailand, which is important because they were one of the first federations to leave the IBF for the WBF. What also caused this was the fact that the IBF had the biggest and most prestigious tournaments, namely the All England, and because players whose federations were under the WBF couldn't play, it caused the players themselves to start to protest. One specific example of this was from Lee Arn-go and Tan Eng Han of Singapore. At a WBF event, they defeated the All England and World Champions Chun Chun and Wahudi. They wanted to play the All England, but because Singapore was no longer a part of the IBF, they couldn't. This stunned them, leading one of them to say, "When will all this politicking cease? At the end of it all, we're the biggest losers. And yet it's us, the players, whom the fans want to see, not some self-professed politician." Another thing that was helping push the two federations together was a particular friendly match between China and Indonesia. These two had originally faced in Hong Kong in December of 1979, where Indonesia had underestimated China and lost. This time in Singapore, Indonesia brought their full-strength squad and wanted revenge. What transpired was one of the greatest team matches ever, with the men's singles between Lee Yim-Soo-King and Han Yang hailed as the match of the decade. Quite the claim when you consider the decade was only 2 months old. Indonesia did win 7-6, a combination of men's and women's matches, but the Chinese scored a huge men's match win. But the winners didn't really matter. It was the level of badminton that had the whole badminton world talking, with everyone saying the same thing. If the badminton world unites, then we could see matches like this happen every single time. That can only be what's best for badminton. Even though the WBF was losing some members, the IBF was growing, and China was easing its stance, there were still some changes the IBF had to make in order for the unification to happen, with the biggest being something I mentioned before, voting rights. And on March 23rd, 1981, at an IBF EGM, some big changes were made. These were: Rule 8C. Large countries with more than 50,000 players now get an extra vote. This change was approved by a vote of 63-3. Rule 8D. There will now be 2 voting systems. Membership-related decisions will use a one-member, one-vote system. All other decisions will use an expanded proportional voting system. England suggested that expelling a member should not follow the one-member, one-vote rule, but this suggestion was defeated by a vote of 44-12. The overall proposal for dual voting was then approved by 57-7. These changes to voting rules had a profound effect on this whole IBF-WBF situation. The WBF had always said that proper talks wouldn't happen until the voting situation had changed. Now it had. And with that, on Tuesday, May 26, 1981, in Tokyo, Japan, the deed of unification was signed by IBF President Stella Molin and Dawi Chulaspia for the WBF, witnessed by many representatives from both federations. A cocktail party followed, with it being obvious to everyone in attendance that a new age had begun. The question now was, would this new age involve the Olympic Games? Hopes were high, as the main obstacles had seemingly been cleared. But as those were cleared, others emerged.